after a long break. So let me start off by giving some instructions. Subscribe to the workshop live role if you haven't subscribed. And don't forget to fill in the previous feedback forms along with which we will be posting today, because attendance will be taken from that. And also for your certificates, we will be considering your previous reviews and attendance as well based on that. And for today, we have a special person as a speaker for this day, and it's none other than Joshua Frankle, the Vice President of Engineering. So he's a perfect tech enthusiast who's very approachable, friendly, and is always ready to clear your doubts. So hi, Joshua, over to you.
Hi. Yeah, wait, let me stream first. Yeah. Is my stream visible?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Am I audible and is stream okay, Jason?
Yeah, Joshua, it's perfect.
Okay, cool. So yeah. Okay, so for some of you, if you are wondering, like, are you in the right workshop where you just missed and came? No, this is just the same backend development expert workshop. Just I am taking part only this series. In this series, we'll be seeing about authentication and authorization. So first, before explaining, how many of you know about authentication and authorization? So if you know authorization or authentication, or some of you might have thought both are same. If you know, react to the message that I put in the coders chat. So how many of you know, please react to it. So I will have a count. 1. That's easy to, sorry, it's typo. Yeah. Okay, 7 of you, 8. Okay, only 8 of you. Okay, 8 of you know it. Okay, let me pick one from the 8. Yeah, Mark, what do you know about authentication and authorization?
Yeah, authentication is like you get the details from, it's like a portal, right? So login page. So you get the details, or you sign up for something, and you, with that account, you'll kind of enter into a website or something like that into your account. So in auth, this is the one I said now is authentication. The authorization part is that some people should be kind of accessed only to some website pages or something like that, because not everybody should be kind of accessible to every page or something like that. So for an admin role, only all pages will be accessible for him, but for the user's role, only some pages will be kind of accessible for the admin role, for the user's role, I guess. Yeah, this is what authorization means.
Yeah, right.
Basically.
That's, yeah, correct, Mark. That's perfectly right answer. So yeah, basically authentication is meaning it's like who the user they say to be. Like take an example of the ID card that you wear to your college, right? Only if you have your LICET ID card, you'll be known as a LICETian, so that you can enter into LICET college. So your ID card, they authenticate you with your ID card, right? So that's how authentication works. That's a basic example of authentication. Where authorization comes in is, it's like LICET ID card is for students as well as teachers, right? But teachers have more access levels than we students have. So that's where authorization comes in. Okay, authorization is basically meaning access levels. Authentication is who you say to be. Are you a LICETian? Is for the example. So that's the basic idea of what's authentication and authorization. So how these authentication and authorization was done in browsers. We'll see how this was done in the browser side. Okay, so 1 second. Yeah. Okay, so now we have a browser and a server and a database, right? So before, how authentication or authorization was done using, there is something known as cookie based authentication, right? So this is how browsers used to do authentication and authorization. So how it usually works is, your browser initially, a user first time logs in. For example, if a user first time logs in, so when a browser, the user first time logs in, when a user first time logs in, he sends the email ID and password, right? So he sends the email ID and password to the server. So then the server, with the information, it compares with the database where the email ID and password is there in the record of the database. So if there is the record, like you are, there is a user already used with the sign in password like email ID and password, session ID will be generated. So what is a session ID? Is just a random generated strings. Okay, it's just a random generated strings, a unique ID which will be given for you. So a random session ID will be generated and will be stored in the database. Okay, so the random session ID will be stored in the database. Then what will happen is, then the session ID will be sent back to the server, and the server will again back send to the browser. And with the session ID, what the as a server will do is, the in the browser we have different storage areas like local storage, sessions, and cookies, right? So usually this session ID will be stored in the cookies of the, we can store in the session and local storage, but usually they do it in the cookie based authentication, so they store it in the cookies. So this session ID will be stored in the client side, will be sent back to the client side, and also will be stored in the database. So once he has logged in now, so once he had logged in, he will be navigate to different pages. He will like click on all the buttons and roam around the pages, but only few pages will be accessible as, for example, let's keep him as a user. Okay, so he's not an admin, so we cannot give all the access to him. So only few pages will be accessible. So on when he requests every page, like he goes to about page and projects page. So for example, every page, a request will be sent to the server again and again. The once request is sent, again the server, no, next time, every time a request is sent, the session ID will be sent along with the request. Like initially we won't have the session ID, so it will be generated in the server and be stored in the DB and sent to the client. Once he has logged in, uh, every time we request for a page, the session ID which is stored in the cookies will be sent again to the server, and again will be compared in the backend in the database to authenticate, to authorize whether he has access to that particular page. So session ID, once he requests for another page again, the session ID, let's just keep it for ID for now. Okay, the session ID will be sent. Now the server compares the session ID which has come and which is in the database. Okay, so it compares, then finds out whether it is a valid session ID. So if it is valid and the user has access to it, then server responds with the page that he asked for. Okay, but if he doesn't have access, then the server will just throw a 404 or redirect him to different page where it doesn't have access. So this is how cookie based basic authentication works for now. Was I clear? How many of you understood this part of the thing till now? Can you react to the message that I put in the coders chat? If you have doubts, you can ask. Okay, 17. Others, if you have any doubts, you can ask. Okay, so the count is slowly increasing. Let's just move on. So this is how cookie-based authentication works. Now, this has its own drawbacks. Okay, what are the drawbacks that this has is, when we store the session ID in the database, it's okay for one instance of a client and a server. When we have a scalable cloud platforms, like when we are supposed to move to different databases, right, we have to change multiple servers, and even when using microservices, or when you want to use multiple devices, like if you want to use browser and you also want the same app to be as a mobile app in your mobile phone, and you want to use it as an IoT device, that where these drawbacks come in. Okay, so when you want to scale up, your session ID is stored in the database, right? So you have to one user, when authenticated, when you change the server, when the same user requests for the same page, he cannot be authenticated because the server has changed and it doesn't contain the session ID that was before. So that's, he has to log in again, the user has to log in again. And for multiple devices in mobile apps, you won't have these features like local storage, cookies, and session and all. Okay, so you have to use another method. So this session, even though it is a good way, but it has its own drawbacks. So that's where JWT comes in. Okay, JWT stands for Json Web Tokens. So what JW does is, yeah, so if you can use this side, this is the Json Web Token side. So what JW does is, it has uh, it has its own hash generated code. How this basically works is, what I said before was cookie based authentication. So what we are going to see now is token based authentication. So both are authentication and authorization, but in a different perspective. Let's see how that works. So this JWT is won't be stored in the database. Okay, that's the main point of this thing. In cookies based authentication, it will be stored in the database. You will be authenticated and authorized with the data in the database. But in JWT, the hash code that it generates will be stored in the client side. It won't be stored in the database. Okay, so what advantage is in this? It means you can scale up your platform, you can scale up your app any number of times, because how much ever you change your server, the token is still remains in your client side. Okay, so when the request is sent, the client sends the request which is stored in the local storage or session or cookies. With that, he will be authenticated. In the backend, we will see how that he'll be authenticated. So that's one plus point of this token based authentication. And even when coming to multiple devices, you won't have a problem storing, because this doesn't use stuff like token based authentication. Is like mainly it's used for mobile apps and IoT devices. It can be used in that, and for microservices. So how this JWT works? Basically, this JWT has divided into three sections. Like the first will be the header, the second is the payload, and third will be the signature, a secret key that you give. So basically, when you see this hashed code, you can see it is differentiated by a three dots, right? So first one is known as the header. So header is basically contains the hashing method or algorithm that you use. The second is this thing. The second thing contains the payload, the data that we send, which will be hashed. And the third thing is where your secret key will be generated. Basically, your secret key will be generated by adding your header, like based encoded your header and your payload plus your secret code. So these three will be generated by this JWT hashed. Okay, this payload will have extra thing called IAT. You can see this subject name and IAT. So basically, we will send this payload. How we'll send is, we'll have this username and we'll have a submin attribute. These are all will be sent in payload, so that in the client side, when the user requests for a server, this JWT will be decoded and will be analyzed where the payload matches the details which we have in the server. So yeah, so this issued at will be expiry time. IAT means is issued at, it's an expiry time, which basically means after how many times this token should be expired. So after this token expired, so that the admin won't have access, the user won't have access to the other page once token is expired. So yeah, these are three parts that JWT is. When you try to tamper with this, like when you try to change this token, if a client, a hacker tries to change the token, like, wait, let me change this one thing. You can see it immediately shows invalid signature, right? Because JWT generated these three in a hashing algorithm. So it decodes with the same algorithm, and when it doesn't match with the same algorithm, it knows it's an invalid generated token. Okay, so you can't tamper with the token that has been sent. It will be easily identified. Uh, so yeah, so these are the main three things you need to know. Is this is separated by three dots, which is first one is header, second one is payload, and third is the secret key, which is generated hashed with the header and the payload that you provide. This is JWT authentication. Now, how this is different from client-based authentication is, as I said, this JWT will not be stored in the server side; it will be stored in the client side. So every time you request a page, what will happen is, let me switch it. Yeah. So yeah, every time you request for a page, what will happen is, okay, let's now see about JWT authentication. So every time you request for a server for a page, the server with the email ID and password will generate a JWT token. Okay, the JWT token will be generated in the server side. So once the token is generated, it will be sent back to the browser and it will be stored in the local storage or session. So every time the user asks for a data, uh, the JWT token will be sent with the request. And in the server, the JWT token that is sent will be decoded and will be analyzed whether uh, the hash token matches the T-code payload that we sent. If it is true, then the server will request for the data that client has asked, then it will be sent back. Otherwise, when the invalid token generates, we will redirect the client. So this is how JWT token works. See, where you don't have contact with the database as much as you did in the cookie based authentication. This is one main difference between JWT and cookie based authentication. Um, what else is, yeah, so how many of you understood so far? Like, did I get did it very faster, and I spoke very fast? How many of you understood this part until now, the difference and all the stuff? You can react to the message in the Coda chat. Mhm. If others don't understand, you can unmute and ask your doubts. Or if you want to repeat, I can also repeat the things that I said. Yeah. Okay. So this is basically the authorization and authentication part that I wanted to say. And if I had missed to say, I missed one point, I guess. JWT is basically for authorization, not authentication, because authentication happens only once when you log in initially, and every time you request for a page, what operation happens is authorization. So every time when you request for a page, this JWT token will be sent along with the request that you make. So, and it will be authorized whether you are an authorized user, whether you are an admin or a normal client will be detected by the JWT decoded token. So yeah, JWT is mainly for authorization, not authentication. And yeah, that's all. I want to cover. Fabi, any add-ons?
Audible?
Yeah, Fabian.
Yeah. I mean, why is nobody talking? Why is nobody responding to Joshua? I mean, do you all get it? Or do you want to do it hands-on and see what actually this means? Okay, I'll do one thing. So, I mean, this was a very nice presentation, Joshua. Like, you nailed it.
Thank you.
And so, let's get back to our VS Code. So, you all remember what we did for the past week? You know, we've had a very long break now. I think a lot of these, it might, it's totally a different thing. It really doesn't have anything to do with what we learned over the last week. Okay. So I don't think you'll have any problem with this theory, but let's look at what and how we would actually implement this in our project. Okay, so we do that.
Yes, bro.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Joshua, can you do something?
Yeah.
You keep streaming your OBS for the YouTube so that it doesn't really get off.
Okay.
I'll stream from you. I'll take from you.
Okay.
Make sure you stream my window, YouTube.
Okay.
Can everybody quickly join over to my screen? I mean, give me a yes if you are ready to get started.
Yes. You are streaming your business.
Okay, is it?
The whole OBS.
Okay. No?
Yeah, perfect.
And thank you, Joshua. It was a very last minute call.
Yeah.
And
No problem.
cool. So just like Joshua said, dot authorization is one of the latest standards that you use in authorization, right? So there are age-old or monolithic approaches to how you authorize these endpoints that you have. All these old technologies are not really being used in over these days, and people are actually moving to dot-based authentication. It's been there for a quite lot of time now. Originally, the entire JWT flow, when I say JWT, it means JWT authentication. So people usually say JWT authentication, right? It's an urban slang. So when I say JWT authentication, there was this one company. It's Auth0. Has anybody heard of Auth0?
Yeah.
Yeah, so what do you know about Auth0? Who are they?
Like they provide services like it's just similar to Firebase.
Okay. So in what terms? I mean, Firebase is basically a one-stop solution for an object-based database, an authentication system, an OAuth provider. In what terms does Auth0 correlate with Firebase? Okay, so let me give you a
Authorization.
what?
Like authentication for those.
Exactly. So this is one huge corporate giant that is there out there on the market, right? So in any application that you develop, any SaaS product that you build over the upcoming years, you would probably have to build this entire authentication part of your application, right? So this actually might be simple to talk, or even it might have been a simple part of an entire application, right? But when it comes to actual scalability, like Joshua said, it's a very huge process, and you cannot really just depend on Jwt or on your custom implementation of authentication, right? You can even have your own custom implementation. You can set up your own flow for authorizing a person, right? But you need to provide security. You cannot have any loopholes. You cannot have any backdoors for hackers to get into your app. So for this purpose, you usually go with a very well-recognized company or a very well-recognized authentication provider. So when I say authentication provider, so these people, this entity, right now I took an example of Auth0, this huge company. There are many other companies that do the service out there. So a quick recap about what Joshua said. Jwt is for authorizing your APIs and API endpoints, right? So just we'll look at the flow from the first to the end. A user comes to our app. He tries to log in, right? So he probably sends his username and password to an endpoint that says login in our application. And you all know how to route a login endpoint. So you would take the Express app. You will declare a user endpoint. Over there, you will have user/login, right? And in that login, what you'll do is you'll take this username and password object from the post object or any other parameter from the request. So you take this request, and using this Jwt implementation, you would first create a token. Okay. So initially, even though the entire purpose of Jwt in our application is to authorize endpoints, at the first hit point of this Jwt authorization is basically authentication, right? Of the first time the user authenticates himself and gets a token from the server, okay, and gets a Jwt token from the server. This Jwt token is stored in the local storage or anywhere on the front end, okay, in the browser. Just know that this is stored on the browser, and every other subsequent queries to the further endpoints. So once he's logged in, and further on he requires user information. Further on he requires blog information, right? You cannot give it away for free. You have to have some sort of an authorization. So every time this user tries to hit our endpoint, what we do is we check if this request has this particular token that we gave him back initially when he tried to log in, right? Am I making sense? The first time he tried to log in, we give him back a token, this Jwt token. For every other subsequent queries that he tries to give, for every other subsequent request that he tries to give us, we check if this guy is sending me the Jwt token that I sent him earlier. It's simple, right? Does it is it clear now?
So like one Jwt token is given for like one session. For each session, the new Jwt token is given. I mean, the next time I use it.
It's based on how you implement it. So if you look at this Jwt token, like Joshua said, it has three parts, right? It has a payload, it has a signature, it has the header, and this entire Jwt can be set to expire in a certain period. So it depends on how you implement it. You can expire it in very short terms and expect this login process to happen every time. But basically, how you get this is, as long as the user is signed in, you have this Jwt token with you, right? So as long as the user is signed in and you have this Jwt token, you can't access these endpoints. You get it? You can access any resources on the backend.
Yes.
Okay. Anybody has any question in this flow? The first hit point would be authenticating the user, and further on, the entire Jwt process is basically authorization, like Joshua said, right? Okay. So I'm going to show you how this actually looks. To do this, you have a library called, wait, is my screen visible, or are you seeing my face?
Your screen is visible.
Perfect. So if you look at my code, the very first thing that you would need to do is install a library that handles these chart operations for you, right? So that's Json Web Token. So this library is basically gonna take take care of all the chart generation part, signing in the user, creating an expirable token. All of these tasks will be taken care by this library. So if you look at my code, I'll show you how you can actually start verifying people. Okay. So the first time a user logs in, you would probably have an endpoint, and this endpoint would be like user/login. We'll see how it looks. We're not going to actually build an login endpoint. I'm just going to explain how you actually do this. Okay. So let's get to the login endpoint. So any login endpoint would probably look like this. You have a post endpoint, you have a post method declared, and you have this particular route that says /login. And you take that request, you have request.body.email, you have email in the request body, and you have a password or any other information that you have, right? But the very next thing that you need to do is you need to log them in. So previously when I told you how this chart flow works, the first time the user logs in, we generate a token and give it back to him. So every other subsequent request that he gives to the server, we will verify if this token is valid, right? So that's what we are doing here. We have imported the Json Web Token package. So now we have this Jwt object. So it has all the methods that we need to create all these methods, right? So let's look at the login flow. So once the user tries to log in, you have this one method that says .sign, right? So in here, you can actually set a payload. So if you remember, when we looked at jwt.io, any Jwt token, it's basically a huge piece of, it's a huge hash, right? And this hash has 3 parts. And like Joshua explained, you have a header, you have a payload, and you have a signature. So what we are essentially doing when we set this username and password as the payload is our email and user ID are also being used to generate this hash, right? So if you notice, if I try to change my name from John Doe to Fabian Ferno, it changes, right? You can actually see that the token changes for each different person. So this way, you can authenticate every single person. You can authorize every single endpoints for which these users are requesting, right? So the payload part is done. And the next thing that you send is the signature, right? In the chart hash, you have the last part, which essentially is the signature. And in your signature, there's a very, very important part, right? You have a secret. So usually you call this a server secret. Okay? You would normally not show it to anybody. So this secret needs to be hidden at the server, and nobody should have access to this server secret. So if anybody gets access to this server secret, of course they would be able to they can try to decode our Jwt. Okay, and the other parameter is the expiration time. You can set your Jwt to expire in let's say 12 hours, or you can say 1 hour, or it's totally up to you. You can set it to expire. So once you have this token and you sent it to the user, now the user has now the client, the client side has our token. So from the client side, what they do is every single time they send a request, they take this token and put it in the header. I told you, right? Any request object has a header, has a payload, and it's basically that. You have a header and a payload. In that header, you can store these tokens, and this type of token, you would normally call it a bearer token. Okay, so we look at how these bearer tokens are and how you can actually send it using Postman and try it out, right? The first thing that you can do is, can anybody guess what we might do to implement this verification logic? So my requirement is, I have an endpoint. Before I hit this endpoint, before the user reaches this endpoint, I need a guy in the middle to verify this token and send it to the endpoint, so that all my requests are verified and authorized for the client to use. Can anybody guess what this middle guy is and what is he called? I mean, we've been working with it for a very long time.
A middleware.
Exactly, it's a middleware. So you, as a backend developer, what is your next step? I told you that you can very well write a function that verifies this for you, right? So what will be your next plan of action? Let me make it clear. So you know that you use a middleware to verify. So basically you create a middleware, right? So then the very step would be create a middleware. So you can call it verify token.js or anything, right? So in that verify token file, and you know how to declare a middleware. You have a request object, you have a response object, and a next pointer, right? So if you look at this, we are trying to get the headers, and we will essentially check if the token starts with the word bearer. So I told you the type of header placement that we will be using is a bearer token, and anything that starts with bearer and the hash that follows after the word bearer will be our Jwt token. So essentially, if you look at our header, this will be looking like this. I'll show you an example. I'm going to quickly go back to my VS Code. So yeah. So this is one of my old projects that I had. I told you, right, for every single authorization, in the request header, you will set an authorization key, right? And this authorization key will have this Jwt token. Does it make sense? So that every time this endpoint is requested, the key from this header is also accessible by the server, right? So what our server will essentially be doing in the middleware is, it will take this header, dissect this key, and take the part where it starts with the hash and tries to verify if this Jwt token is valid. Do you get it?
Yeah. What is that bearer part like?
This one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, you can very well have different authorization values, right? So basically, we have this Jwt token, and what we are trying to say to the request object is that this type of key, this type of hash, this type of token is a bearer token. Okay, there are different authorization flows, right, that I told you, and the flow that we are using is by using a bearer token. And if you look at this token, this is basically our Jwt token. So you need not worry about what this bearer means for just now. If you want to know more about what this bearer actually means, you can look up what authorization tokens are and what are the different types of authorization tokens and things like that. Okay. So right now, let's stick to what Jwt means and how to use Jwt for our authorization. Am I being clear?
Yes.
Okay. So now you know our server, our middleware will whenever somebody tries to ping this endpoint, our middleware will come and check for the headers, dissect the key, check if the token is valid, and route them to the proper request endpoint. That is exactly what we've done here. So I don't know if you noticed, I don't think I pushed the code. Yeah, I think I deleted when I initially gave you the boilerplate. So I used to have this dot endpoint. I mean the dot middleware. If you look closely, I've just done what I told you, right? The first step that I do is I check for the headers. I check for the headers, look for any access tokens, or look for any headers that start with authorization, right? The first step, is it clear? You first check if there are any keys that have the name authorization, or if there are any keys that say X access token, right? After taking that token from the header, you check if it starts with bearer. You don't want any other type of token, you just want a bearer token. And you need the hash that follows the word bearer, right? To do that, you slice the string and take you start taking the strings characters after the 7th character. So basically the word bearer has 6 characters and a 7 blank space, and anything that follows after that, you take that and mark it as a token. The very next thing that you do is, I told you, right, you have the Jwt library. So this Jwt library will take care of verifying our token. The first thing that you would send to this verify method is the token itself. So it will take the token, match the signature with our server secret. So I told you, right, you have to keep the server secret very confidential and you cannot leak it out anywhere. So it's a very wrong practice to put it directly on your code. So what can I do? So any guesses on what would be done when I don't want to put any piece of text that should be confidential? Does anybody have a guess?
Use an env file.
Exactly. So you will have the server key, the server secret on an env file and access it to this. So now your server secret is safe and now nobody can really get it from GitHub or whatever. So just for the sake of understanding, I'm just gonna create a random server key, and this server secret doesn't really have to be a hash or any fancy hash algorithms. It can be a random letters and digits, right? You can generate it on your own. You can have a randomizer function to generate this server key for you. So I'm just gonna use my VS Code's inbuilt extension that takes care of this for me. I'm gonna say I'll have a server secret that has a length of 50, right? So now I will take this server key and put it in my env file and refer it anywhere I need it. Okay, am I being clear? So the only two places that you will need to place the server secret is one time is where you verify it, and the other time is where you authenticate the user for the first time. We had the login route, and we created a token for this the user who was trying to log in. Do you all remember? Do you all remember?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's how you basically do a Jwt verification. Jwt authorization for your endpoints. Do you have any doubts in this? So once you've declared the middleware, the next step is very, very easy. You just go to your control. You just go to your route. So let's say you have any particular route. So you have the users route or you have the post route. You don't want anybody without the token to log in. To have access to this resource. So how will you import? How will you use a middleware? How will you use a middleware? It's as simple as this. So every time somebody tries to access a post or the blog post, before sending them to the actual post controller, we verify if they are the right users for our app. we verify if the user has logged in first, right? So if the user is logged in, we get him access to the portion. Or if the user is not logged in, we directly send him a response that says your token is not valid, you need to log in again. So whenever the front end, the client reads this message, he will prompt the user to log in again, right? Is the flow clear?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So that's all about what you need to know about Jwt authentication, Jwt authorization. So for you to test out these headers, you have a tab that says authorization on your Postman, right? You can straight up set a bearer token type of authorization. You set a bearer, and in this token field, you paste your Jwt token, right? So for every single request that this endpoint is made, this token gets appended to the headers over here, and it gets sent to the server. So the server will handle all the authorization and take care of authorizing the person, right? Are you clear? I mean, is it clear on how you use Postman to test out your authorization? Because once you've started authorizing your endpoints, it becomes hard for you to test, right? You cannot really test it without sending the token. You need to be logged in. So the first thing that you do is you create a sign-in endpoint. You create a login endpoint. In that login endpoint, you try to log in. And if the login is successful, you get back a token. And you take that token, paste it in the token field over here, and for every other request to any other resources, this token will be sent to the resource, sent to the route, and this route will have the middleware which takes care of all the authorization. Is it clear on how you can use Postman to test your authorized endpoints, protected endpoints? Is it clear?
Yeah.
I mean, does anybody have any doubt? Because we've covered a lot in terms of authorization, even though we didn't actually code, but I need you to be clear in how you do this. Okay? Plus, your task will also include you authorizing a few endpoints for you to check this out, right? So I'm not going to actually code the implementation. I want you to try it out because it's very simple, and I need you to understand how this chart entirely works. So let's look at what Auth0 does and what you can actually get from it. So the very reason I usually use Auth0 is my frontend will be wired with Auth0, right? You have all these OAuth providers like Google Sign-In, you have Microsoft Sign-In, and other sign-in. So Auth0 takes care of all the other sign-ins, even custom mail login or any password login. It manages all of these other types of login OAuth providers, and it takes care of getting me the token by its endpoint. So if my front end uses Auth0 as its authentication platform, the user would be logging in using his Google or any other solution, and after logging in, he will be having this token that I told you, right? The same flow, the same Jwt authentication flow. In fact, these guys are the ones who actually built the entire Jwt authentication flow. So what you will be doing is you can have this verify token set up. So this config is basically for any auth providers. So I've done it for Auth0's implementation. So all of this, the entire function of verifying and using the Json Web Token library and creating the server key and all of these, right? This is done by Auth0, and we just need to call the necessary endpoints and just pass in this Jwt auth tag for us to verify that person who has logged in using one of these Auth0's login solutions, right? You have Firebase and you have different solutions. Auth0 is just like them, and over there they send you the Jwt token, and you can basically use this Jwt token to give access to your endpoints. Am I being clear here? So what I'm trying to say is, Auth0 basically takes care of all the authentication flow, including authorizing your APIs, right? You get it?
Yes, bro.
Okay. I mean, the other thing that I wanted to tell you was try to explore what Auth0 provides. You also have different login solutions. I mean, this is very fun to play with, and it's totally free for anybody who would like to try it out. So I want you to try that. So let's come to the final part of this entire workshop, and we look at what you'll actually be building. So a very detailed explanation would be given you. I'll send it out in text, but to put it all in line, you will basically build an API. You know that. And this API should involve all these methods, different methods that we've learned. We have post method, we have put method, we have delete method, and of course you have options to try out different other methods that we haven't really covered in the workshop. Okay? You are free to use that. And not just that, I need you to have a minimum of 3 endpoints, and these 3 endpoints should talk to the Prisma schema and try to get information out of it. It actually should make sense. So one of these examples could be we did blogging API, right? Maybe if you're gonna do a blogging API, it should have more features than what we just built, right? It should have more relations, should have more nested queries, or you should. I just want you to try exploring all of these possible outcomes you have in Express. So you will be judged based on that, and I'm not going to restrict you by giving any tasks in this, but I think I pretty much covered a lot over the past, I think 6 days or 7 days. So if you have any questions, just ping me and I'll be right here to help you out. Even the DMZ committee will be there to help you out. I will be giving a further detailed task overview of what you'll be building over the evaluation. So that's all about the entire Express-based workshop. And there is a lot, there's a lot more to Express.js. There are advanced concepts in Prisma and even more things that you can actually explore. All the best for you to go down that lane and explore it yourselves. I hope that I've given you a head start so that you actually get started as a backend web developer. So, yep, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fabian, for the last, I think, 2 weeks of this workshop. And guys, don't forget to fill in the feedback forms. And thank you so much for your enthusiastic participation as well. We were so much happy to meet you all. And do take part in the upcoming LearnSite sessions and the workshops as well. Thank you, guys.